Greetings and salutations, everyone. Battle for Azeroth was an expansion met with a lot of diverse opinions, and for the most part has gone down as one of the bad expansions of the likes of Warlords of Draenor and Cataclysm. While I do agree that it has its faults, I also think it had good and enjoyable aspects as well. So today, I'm going to go over what I liked and didn't like in the narrative of Battle for Azeroth. With all that being said, let's get started with my thoughts and opinions on the expansion's negatives. The very start of the expansion starts with the Horde's assault on the home of the Night Elves and their world tree. This is where a lot of the problems start to circulate. Instead of a plot where the Alliance starts the war, it's once again the Horde, and not only that, it is from a tricked Saurfang, who at the time had recently warned Sylvanas he'd be watching her. Originally, nobody knew who exactly burnt down the World Tree, and for a while it was under some serious speculation. They even hyped up this grand question, making it seem like Sylvanas was not remotely close to being the culprit, and she of course later ended up becoming just that. There were also key moments that were in the novellas that had been left out completely in the questlines, and they were some serious game changers, quite literally. Sylvanas just being the very thing she once fought against, while poetically nice, just became more and more frustrating after we had just dealt with Garrosh only a few years ago. This was a very poor start for the expansion. Kul Tiras, the homeland of the Kul Tirans and their navy fleet, looked extremely promising, and at some points it was. However, there were quite a lot of quests that weren't so enticing. For instance, most of Stormsong Valley did not feel connected. You had conflicts with the Stormsong people, Quilboar, Ettins, the Horde, and so forth, but really the only one that felt like it honestly mattered was the Stormsong threat. And as a fellow Horde player, witnessing the atrocities that the Horde commits to Brenadem, it was just awful. While it was a Forsaken commander who issued the order, you had a lot of the Horde soldiers take great pleasure in the horrors they committed. It felt like they punched the Horde to an 11 on just how evil they could be. This is the same Horde, I remind you again, that took out Garrosh not so long ago for similar deeds. You also had Tierguard Sound, which actually had a pretty decent start, but it quickly went all over the place, and I got overwhelmed and confused for most of its story. I wish they had just done more with Talia Fordragon, the daughter of the once Lich King. She felt like she was going to be a big player in this expansion, and then she faded into obscurity. Justfar had a good theme, and was probably the best of the three, but the Witch Mother felt too evil, in fact. I think that all the villains in Kul Tiras had no redeeming factors to them in where this evil even came from. Ashvane could have been what Jaina could turn into if she didn't let go of her hatred for the Horde, for instance. She should have been someone you could pity over losing their family to the Horde. Instead, she became a typical power-hungry villain. Ultimately, I wasn't too keen on the story of the zones and the characters in them in Kul Tiras. In Battle for Azeroth, the worldwide conflict saw battles take place in different regions of the continents, with the two major ones being Arathi Basin and Darkshore. While the revamp to the zones graphically and musically were stunning, as always, there was no real story to them. Arathi had recently been the place where the Desolate Council met their end in the novel Before the Storm, and there's a small nod to it with the gravestones. But all that happens there is a fight between an Alliance commander and the Horde commander at random. I would have loved to have seen some kind of story take place there, as Arathi is of great importance to the Forsaken, for a new home, and for the orcs' resting site of their former warchief Ogrim, and is of course great importance to the Alliance, as it is the location of the first great human kingdom. With Darkshore, they actually did have a story, but unfortunately it was very lackluster for both sides. For the Alliance, it was about retaking their homeland, which of course was successful later on, and bringing justice for the fallen who died in the War of Thorns. With the Horde, it was about raising the dead and ruining the forests. Not a storyline I was particularly a fan of. I definitely think if you were a big fan of Sylvanas and her bizarre version of the Horde, you may have liked it, but it wasn't my jam. It was very easy to root for the Alliance to take back their home in Darkshore, but Arathi had me way more conflicted. There really wasn't much of a story to be had with either one of these war fronts, and it's a shame that we didn't get something better. Battle for Azeroth had a great deal of new and old characters in the mix. Some of them that come to mind were Prophet Zul, King Rastakhan, Lady Ashbane, Rexxar, Zelling, Gien, N'Zoth, who we'll get to later, Sylvanas, who we'll also get to shortly as well, Illyria, and Anduin Wrynn. These characters, for me, felt like there could have been more to them in this expansion. Prophet Zul, this guy was an orchestrator of rallying up the Troll tribes in Cataclysm, the resurrection of Lei Shen, the Thunder King, and the creator of the entire conflict in Zandalar through his devotion to G'huun. I felt like he should have been able to accomplish way more and should have had his own unique raid instead of being a flunky to some fake old god. He definitely deserved better. King Rastakhan. This is a character who's existed and been a name drop since Classic. He had a pretty decent role at first, but quickly was shoved away in the place of Talanji. I really felt as if he should have had more of a role as king of his people. Rexxar, one of my favorite characters, made his return to the story because Jaina was causing problems. It seemed like they were setting him up to do something great, but they sidelined him and nothing really happened between him and Jaina. Zelling, a Forsaken Tide Sage capable of communing with the elements. Interesting character, but was quickly killed off by Nathanos. He easily was one of the less dramatic, gloomy Forsaken, and you really felt for him. We could have gotten Forsaken Shaman for Pete's sakes with the help of Zelling. Just why? You could have done that. You could have done that for Shadowlands, and you kill him. It's just awful what they do with Zelling. Gen, one of the most affected by Sylvanas' misdeeds. He was present as a representative of the Alliance in Kul Tiras, and had the most anger to the Horde and their warchief. We honestly should have gotten something more between him and the Banshee Queen. Illyria, the eldest Windrunner, was given quite the spotlight at the tail end of Legion as one of the few who could control the Void, and had a clear vendetta against the Horde and her younger sister Sylvanas. Instead, they chose to make her a recruiter and nothing else. With the old gods and her sister out and about, this should have been a great time for her to show off what she's made of, and they didn't. Lastly, Anduin. The recently crowned king of Stormwind was hyped up to have a big part in the story, but instead only appeared to issue orders or team up with Saurfang on occasion. He had great moments now and then, but they progressively diminished as the expansion went on. This should have been a learning period for Anduin to not see that not everyone can be negotiated with, and that peace was not always the answer. I overall think these characters should have been treated much better in this expansion than they should have been. The expansion's B-plot, eventual A-plot, was mending the damage of Sargeras and his mighty sword with the likes of Magni, dragons, and Titan Keepers. It was probably the blandest part of the story until Rathian showed up, and even then it had moments of boredom. This is odd because I usually enjoy it when neutral characters come together to help each other out, but this time, not so much. Azerite, which was built up to be a highly wanted resource, was just another AP grind, contributing very little in the story, aside from just being used for explosives or siege weaponry. We're talking about the very blood of Azeroth, which should have had catastrophe levels of sundering if used to the extreme. Magni, once king of Ironforge, became an exposition reader, with only a few view linkings of his past life here and there. The dragon aspects, while cool to see again, didn't feel as impactful as they should have been when joining in on the healing of Azeroth. Once we got to the very end of said healing, it didn't feel like it was actually resolved. The sword is still there in the same place, and as far as we know, the blood is still leaking out all over the place. So the healing of the planet storyline felt unfinished and really dull for the most part. And speaking of finales, N'Zoth the Corruptor had built up as an antagonist since around the time of the Cataclysm. N'Zoth had been responsible for the Black Dragonflight's corruption, the birth of the Naga, the Cataclysm caused by Deathwing, and the Emerald Nightmare. N'Zoth and his Old God siblings were once a big deal. However, in Battle for Azeroth, when this guy finally is unleashed upon the world as one of the first Old Gods to have ever escaped, he is immediately defeated with almost no casualties. Not only that, but his very end spells the end of his realm Ny'alotha and the Black Empire. What should have been its own expansion was resolved in one single patch, and it doesn't feel earned or right. I had a very similar experience when it came to the character of Kil'jaeden and the planet of Argus. Stuff that should have been held for its own expansion was done in before it had a proper build-up. N'Zoth was a very wasted character who deserved better than what he got after being built up for so many years. Two of my most disliked characters of Battle for Azeroth were none other than Sylvanas and her boyfriend Thanos. When it comes to Sylvanas, she's the all-knowing genius who's laid out all the possibilities on the table. She's untouchable, she's brilliant, she's powerful, and she started this whole war. She was also very unlikable when it came to having meet and greets with her. Regardless if you chose her side or not, you'd be in on the dark on what exactly her plans were, and when it came down to downing the Alliance and winning the war. In Legion, I grew to slowly like her, because it felt like she was making the necessary steps to changing how she acted. But that went out the window in Stormheim and at the start of BFA. She is very much an antagonist. During the majority of this expansion, when dealing with the Alliance, I didn't feel proud of being Horde. I felt disgusted and uncomfortable. Although this went away the moment you finally got to rebel against her. Along with Sylvanas, you had her right hand, Nathaniel, who was even more aggravating and annoying to deal with. At least with Sylvanas, you didn't interact with her too much, but Nathanos, you spent the vast majority of your time with him pretty much everywhere. Nathanos is the epitome of what is wrong with the Forsaken. He constantly berates you, the Horde, and your new allies. He never shut up about how much we must please his Dark Lady, and so on. Nathanos in small doses was fine during Legion, but you really got that with the war campaign, leveling, and even in raids. These two were once enjoyable to an extent, but now they are characters I simply cannot stand, and Battle for Azeroth made this very, very clear to me. Siding with Saurfang was by far the easiest choice they ever provided. Whew. I think I've gotten most of what I had problems with in the expansion out of the way. Let's go ahead and cover what I actually liked about this now. A character that originally started out as a simple NPC that was overglorified and appreciated by players quickly rose to fame. He was taken notice of by Blizzard, and they gave him an identity, a voice, and this quickly made him even more liked and appreciated by the player base. Never would I imagine that I would ever place him at the top of my favorite characters, but here we are. Saurfang had initially started the war under Sylvanas' crafty wording by leading the attack on the lands of the Night Elves. But once Orcish honor was off the table and the tree was burned, he immediately changed his tune and believed the honor in the Horde was lost. Thankfully, through his would-be, but not son, Zakan, he was stirred away from taking his own life. From here on out, Saurfang was imprisoned, freed, and then went on to create his own rebellion against Sylvanas by retrieving Thrall, saving an arrested Bane, and forming the unity that had been broken with the Alliance to take down their wayward warchief no matter the cost. Battle for Azeroth is very much his story. The tale of a veteran who's lost everything, makes several mistakes, and aims to correct them. His actions, aside from Bane's, is what kept the heart of the Horde whole. This guy was what made playing Horde bearable in this expansion. Every time he got his own cinematic, cutscene, or questline, it was vastly enjoyable for when you played Horde, because it felt like you were playing your faction again, and not some scourgified variant of it. While I would have preferred it if we would have gotten more in terms of quests, what we got was still very good, especially in the amazing quality that the cinematic team pulled off. It culminated with Varrock Saurfang wielding both Shalabane and Thrall's mighty axe, representing both the Alliance and the Horde, joined arms against Sylvanas. He believed everyone, including the Forsaken, had to be saved from the cold hands of Sylvanas, who had ruined their faction and their world. Fully knowing he'd die, but die ensuring there was a future for everyone. Varrock Saurfang is a legend, and I don't think I can truly put in my words of what he did for this expansion in the form of a summary. Jaina Proudmoore is a character with a long history of starting all the way back from the Warcraft 3 days, and has honestly been a character who's come close to being one of my least favorite to most favorite to least favorite again. Especially during Legion, where she outright left the Kirin Tor because the Horde was in Dalaran again. But this is a positive list, and Battle for Azeroth did a lot to mend the damage that had been done to her, making her one of my favorite Alliance characters again. Starting off, they showed her mission to listen to her father's passing words and embrace her forgotten hatred towards the Horde. Following this, she returned to her homeland as a fugitive for her past actions of siding with the Horde during her people's initial attack on the Orcs' new homeland of Durotar. She was then cast out and sent to the lands of the Drust, where she was living a waking nightmare. With her mother's new perspective, this enabled her to aid her daughter in her time of need, helping her with the burdens she had carried. Jaina would succeed her father and be named Lord Admiral after saving her kingdom from the likes of Lady Ashrain, but that's not all she did to win me over again. After this, she continued her war with the Horde, leading the siege against the Zandalari, and in some ways mirroring what Rexxar did to Dalen by assisting in the removal of King Rastakhan. She'd however be softened and reminded of the good Horde through Bane, returning her brother back to her after nearly being twisted by Sylvanas. This prompted her back into some of her old habits of believing the Horde and the Alliance could coexist, even aiding with Bane's rescue and the Horde's rebellion against Sylvanas much later. Jaina was the truest MVP of this expansion for the Alliance, and even for the Horde rebels at times, through teleportation and flying ships. I greatly enjoyed her arc, and I am extremely happy to be able to like her character once again. A newly added character, Princess, or now Queen Talanji, is the daughter of King Rastakhan. She was introduced to us as an Alliance prisoner for reasons still unknown. She was accompanied by the Dark Prophet Zul. Sylvanas wanted her, probably for something sinister, but we ended up instead returning her and the Prophet Zul back to Zandalar. This is where she begins to rise as the new leader, as it is revealed she left her lands to seek the aid of the Horde to help with the threat of the Blood Trolls. While I like Rastakhan, he is stuck in his ways at times. Talanji, on the other hand, isn't caught up in the past as her father. Talanji has great respect and even admiration for the deceased war chief and Darkspear chieftain, Vol'jin. Through this, we can get why she enjoys the company of the Horde and the Darkspear representative, Rokhan, within Nazmir. Together, the Horde and Talanji's expedition are able to stop the threat of the Blood Trolls and their plot to release G'huun. But Talanji's journey doesn't end there. When the Alliance arrives to thwart the union between her kingdom and the Horde, to prevent the Horde gaining Zandalari's naval fleet, she helps lead the defensive charge against them. However, the Alliance are one step ahead and deceive the defenders with a misdirection, seizing the advantage to kill King Rastakhan. Talanji is made aware of the deal between Bonsandi and her father as he dies, and she is named queen thereafter. She learns from the lessons of her father and makes the necessary corrections as queen, even telling Sylvanas that they are equals. While she didn't take part in the rebellion against Sylvanas, her story will be further concluded in the book Shadows Rising. Talanji is definitely one of my favorite newly added characters within World of Warcraft, and I look forward to seeing what they do with her, hopefully in Shadowlands. In World of Warcraft, we are often subjected to or hinted at about regions around the world. Some of these areas are newly added, while others have existed in the game's maps or lore for ages. In Battle for Azeroth, we got to go to 4 places that we have been in the lore for a long time. The ancient jungle lands of the Zandalari, where the Horde met with several Loa and the King Rastakhan. It was of course a very Aztec and troll-themed area that I greatly loved. It had been mentioned countless times during the lore, and mainly foreshadowed during Mist of Pandaria, where it was undergoing damages from the Cataclysm. The human kingdom of Kul Tiras, which was very centered and focused on the sea. This was Jaina Proudmoore's homeland, where we ventured to and had been referenced to countless times prior. Nazjatar, home of the Naga, was also seen during Battle for Azeroth, where we got a glimmer at what the Naga's kingdom looked like, with very little swimming needed as Azshara was nice enough to part the waters for us. And lastly, though only in a raid, we finally got to see Ny'alotha, the City of Dreams, foreshadowed all the way back by Yogg-Saron's puzzle box and Y'Shaaraj's heart. Here, we got to see N'Zoth's ideal world, filled with chaos and lots of tentacles. It was a very good time to be alive to finally see these types of places after so many years of hearing about them. It was a real treat. Battle for Azeroth did something that they hadn't in quite some time. It had several characters not only make an appearance or minor cameo, but a full-on return in either quests, questlines, or even cinematics. This would stem from major characters, minor characters, retcon characters, and even racial leaders, who you would think would show up more often in the game, but for some reason just don't. While not all of them would play a big role, it was just nice to see familiar faces again, even if it was for a short time. Biggest characters I was really happy about returning were of course, Thrall and Rexxar. Rexxar because he's my favorite character and is rarely ever seen in this game for some odd reason. And Thrall because he's my second favorite character, and I devoted a whole amazing CGI cinematic just for his return, after leaving in Legion. That part in Legion left a bad taste in my mouth, Anyways, I am very glad that those two are back, and or had a role to play in this expansion. It felt like they were really trying their best to include as many characters as possible from past lore and recent lore. It felt like the whole world was involved in this war for Azeroth, and that felt special to me. Would I have some of these characters have bigger roles? Of course. But the fact that they were involved at all put a smile on my face. One of the returning characters in Battle for Azeroth was Queen Azshara, former Queen of the Night Elves and one of the most influential characters and villains in all of World of Warcraft. This lady alone was one of the ones who started the entire war of the Ancients, and all just for some one-on-one time with Sargeras. She did actually play a pretty big role in this expansion, being the puppet master of sorts behind both Prophet Zul and Lady Ashvane, both who were primary antagonists of their respective zones, making her major debut in her own patch, Rise of Azshara, whose name for once was pretty accurate. Here, she drags the Alliance and Horde and Nazjatar in hopes of freeing N'Zoth and killing him. Queen Azshara did not meet her end by the end of the raid though, and was ironically saved by N'Zoth. We later see her in Ny'alotha being tortured, and after we set her free, she provides us the means to end N'Zoth once and for all. The last we see of her is exiting a void portal, leaving her to return at any given point in the future story. Killing Azshara in the patch she was introduced to was something many, myself included, were worried about, as she was given not much of a spotlight in most of Warcraft, and if she met her end in either 8.2 or 8.3, it wouldn't feel right and it would just suck. Thankfully, she didn't, and this means we can see her get her own expansion a major part in the story at some point. Certainly something Blizzard should get props for doing, as she's definitely an interesting antagonist that should be saved for later. One of the things I always like is when we return to a location we hadn't been in a while. This was more common in Cataclysm and in Legion. Though, during Battle for Azeroth we did do this in certain patches, like in the Underhold to save Bane, one of my favorite quests in this expansion by the way. And speaking of the Underhold, in the same expansion it had been introduced to, we returned to Pandaria in the patch Visions of N'Zoth. While it definitely could have been handled better, it again was extremely nice just to go back to this mystical place that I favor very fondly. If you know me, Mist of Pandaria is one of my favorite expansions of all time, and coming back to it in the current timeline when an old god was unleashed upon the world was great. Seeing Lorewalker Cho, the Stormstouts, Terran Zoo, and the August Celestials, the Mogu, the Mantid, the Hosen, etc. all over again was just so nice, and it brought back really good memories. I hope they do this again in the near future with other areas, and I and many others really liked. Lastly, one of the things I liked about this expansion was finally putting an end to the Horde's rather corruptive leadership. Now, I, like many others, really enjoy the title and stories we had with every warchief, from Thrall to Garrosh to even Sylvanas, albeit not as much as those other two, with her. But we usually ran into the same problem that even the likes of Saurfang addressed. The Horde was born out of war, and a lot of their customs and even leadership structures were based around it. It comes to the culmination to Sylvanas' story as Warchief, where so many stuck to their guns of the Blood Oath, which is basically devoting yourself to the Horde and its Warchief, which Mist of Pandaria poked holes right through in the event that a Warchief no longer cared about the denizens of the whole Horde. A similar situation would happen again with Sylvanas. After uniting with the Alliance to dispose of yet another leader, the Horde leaders come together and agree that there is no place for a Warchief when it is time for peace, allowing all leaders of the Horde to have a voice rather than just one person. I, for one, like this choice because it makes it much more difficult for the Horde to turn dark on us again, but it also allows for the likes of Lorthamar, Thrall, Bane, Dalarisra, G. Firepaw, Lillian Voss, etc. to have a role in the story, and not just one of them to have a story. I, for one, am just really happy with this decision, and I look forward to see how they handle it in future expansions. In conclusion, Battle for Azeroth will go down a very divisive expansion, with a lot of good and a lot of bad. I don't think it's on the same levels of Warlords of Draenor or Cataclysm bad, but it's nowhere near perfect either. I think I'll have a soft spot for it, and many stories that it told. I hope that my points made it clear on why I felt the way I do about this expansion. Again, it's not perfect, but it's not horrible either. Tell me your own thoughts on what you thought on this expansion down below. What did you like about it? What drove you crazy about it? I would actually like to hear how you felt about it, as the common consensus is everybody disliked it a lot, so let me know about what you thought in the comment section down below. You can follow me on Twitter to hear me shitpost or talk about my opinions a lot. You can join me on Discord to talk about all sorts of things. Or, if you really want to, you can follow me on Twitch, where I'm not very active, but I'll try to do things more on there when I have free time. Links of that are down below, by the way. Also, if you like these videos, you can support me on Patreon, where I do my best to give you guys a decent amount of rewards and previews to upcoming machinimas or other projects, like these amazing folks here. But until next time, my friends, see ya!